Hello, everybody. My name is Dziadowiec. I'm a PhD student at Coventry University, working on a thesis at the moment called Dúchas, Locating and Nourishing the Roots of Scotland's Land Reform Revolution. And this here, originally this was a talk that I gave at the Soillse Rooting Language Policy in the Speaker Community Conference back on the 31st of August of 2022, but due to technical issues, the recording of that original talk cannot be used, so I'm just re-recording it here today from home. I'll start sharing my screen now, and we can get going. So, Chànain, Chànain, agus and Anthropocene, Freagairtean a Lèirsinn Ghàidhealach. To kick this presentation off, I think the proper thing to do would be to explain how I'm going to be engaging with the four main terms that appear in its title. Chànain, the land question, Chànain, the language question, the Anthropocene, and Lèirsinn Ghàidhealach, or Gaelic perspective. I'm going to start with the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, literally, is a new geological epoch in which the impact of mankind's activities on Earth and atmosphere are so major, and still growing, that they can be considered one of the greatest forces shaping the Earth's geology and ecology today. Since the year 2000, when Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stormer introduced the term Anthropocene, many of the most infamous aspects of the Anthropocene, such as human-caused climate change and pollution, have only gotten worse. On the other hand, awareness surrounding these issues has also increased, so at least there's that. Now, those of us who live in the islands are very aware of climate change and the effect it has and will have on island communities, and therefore the Gaelic-speaking heartlands. To illustrate this issue in an island context, I would like to share a picture with you now, a picture of an art installation called Lines, which Finnish artists Pekka Niittyvirta and Timo Aho created at Ghàidhealach in North Uist back in 2019. The lines that they created with LED lights reflect what could well be Uist's new coastline by the year 2100, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, if greenhouse gas emissions remain at high rates, between 0.5 meter to 1 whole meter higher than it is today. But there's more to the Anthropocene than just the dangers of rising sea levels. There is pollution, including that in the form of microplastics, which are so small that we breathe them in, eat them, and have them running around in our bloodstreams. Coastal areas like the Hebrides are most exposed to these kinds of dangers, and this has been shown in Teresa Pavlikova's research using Uist soil samples just last year. There are also things like species loss, habitat loss, and many other forms of environmental damage. There is, however, another layer of loss and destruction altogether, and it is cultural. Global capitalism, fueled by Western society's overconsumption, is driving the loss of languages and cultures around the world. 2/3 of the world's 7,000 to 7,500 estimated languages are indigenous languages, and 1/3 of those are experiencing language loss, said Lewis and Simons. And as many as 90% of those are predicted to fall silent by the end of the century, says McCarthy. In the global south especially, colonialism, imperialism, forced policies of assimilation, and land and resource theft are tragically not historical affairs, but contemporary issues. And the global loss of biodiversity, of environmental and cultural destruction are therefore the unwanted outcomes of the Anthropocene. I've already hinted at how this term related to both land and language, but I will now move on to defining Chànain and Chànain, so that we can move on to the Lèirsinn Ghàidhealach as well as the more hopeful territory in the form of Freagairtean, solutions or answers. So let's begin with Chànain, or the land question, as it is in English. A phrase that I believe very many of you are familiar with. The phrase in the context of the Ghàidhealach is a sort of umbrella term under which land inequalities, both past and present, fall. Now, this includes the issues themselves, such as the clearances, concentration of land in increasingly fewer hands, land sitting empty while people go hungry or homeless. However, it also includes debate and action spurred on by these issues. The land raids, rent strikes, skirmishes with the police and the army, political petitioning and debates in Scotland and Westminster as to how the land question should be resolved, and so on. Now, the earliest occurrence of this word in print, which I was able to find, is from back in 1902, in an essay that the Celtic scholar Donald MacKinnon wrote for Machtala, which was a Gaelic newspaper published in Sydney in Cape Breton in Canada. My translation of the Gaelic up there on the screen is this: "It is all too difficult to settle the land question in the Ghàidhealach. There is much land lying waste, and many landless people looking at it with fond, desirous eyes. For as long as matters continue in this way, the people shall not be satisfied, and it would be neither natural nor appropriate for them to be." The way that Donald MacKinnon used this term, with very little explanation, suggests that the phrase Càistin was already widely understood in 1902, leading me to believe that the term originated in the 1880s perhaps, or indeed sometime earlier. But regardless, use of this term has continued through the 20th century and is still widely used in the contemporary debate on land reform and land rights in the Highlands and Islands. Sometimes it will appear as Strí in Erin, or other similar phrases like As in Erin, the title of this wonderful book from the 80s to commemorate the centenary of the Crofters' Risings right there. Just last year, Mary McFadden and Rernage Sandilands published a paper in the journal Scottish Affairs in which they explored creative responses to Càistin in the Ghàidhealach through a process which they call cultural darning and mending. When contextualizing Càistin, McFadden and Sandilands point out that Scotland's many contemporary land issues are rooted in historical injustices, such as the clearances and the transatlantic slave trade, and that further reform is desperately needed in order to halt the legacy of these historical wrongdoings and do something about the Gaeltach's fragile economy, rural housing crisis, and the decline of Gaelic. Now, crucially, McFadden and Sandilands note the connection between Càistin, the climate crisis, and the cause and effect relationship of cultural and biodiversity loss. In many cases, they say, damage to culture and language comes first, followed by a disregard and abandonment of local knowledge. So it is little wonder that the removal of the Gaeltach's indigenous population in the past, ergo loss of culture, language, and local knowledge, paved the way to the creation of a wet desert, which is a term that the ecologist Frank Fraser-Darling famously used to describe Scotland's ecologically devastated deer forest landscape. But Darling firmly believed that the largely devastated terrain could be restored with appropriate policies and measures. The restorative darning and mending proposed by McFadden and Sandilands as a way of dealing with Càistin is based largely on a re-engagement with the local, for example, through what they call creative community ethnology, as well as interacting with Bibliography, that is folklore, Eneminache, place names, and so forth. And as you can see, there's already quite a lot of canon or language involved in all this, so I'll swiftly move on to what I mean by Càistin. Now, Càistin may be the easiest term to define out of the four I mentioned at the start of my talk, because ultimately it was the reason why everybody gathered at the Soillse conference. When I use the term Càistin, I refer to the state of Scottish Gaelic today. I refer to the historical context of how the language has declined from being considered on par with Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and French in certain Scottish schools and universities in the 16th century, to being considered a hindrance to development and improvement scarcely a century or two later. And finally, I refer here to all debates, particularly contemporary, in which we explore future trajectories for Gaelic and revitalizing the language. So without a doubt, the marginalization of Gaels and demonization of Gaelic, which was brought to the fore perhaps around the time of the reign of James VI, is inextricably linked with the injustices of Chànain. Indeed, there seems to be a correlation between those places where major steps towards tackling Chànain have been taken through community land ownership, for example, and community organization and involvement with Chànain. For example, a few miles north of Stornoway, where we were, on the community-owned estate of Ghàidhealach, the Uras Oidach Gowsing or Ghàidhealach Estate Trust, was back then preparing for their annual cultural heritage festival called Dúchas, with very many Gaelic language events being held in cooperation with Commonwealth and other local groups and individuals. In South Uist, also on community-owned land, Ceollas have been championing Gaelic for over 25 years now and will continue to do so from their new base in Soillse. We can also perceive Chànain more globally, of course, in the sense of the loss of indigenous languages all around the world, and Gaelic being but one of them. In this way, Chànain is deeply implicated with the Anthropocene, and the musician, poet, scholar, and Mullach Alistair White captures this in his bilingual anthology Mam Shlé. Hachir is chenga vi chifue. Land and language are inseparably interwoven, he says. And then he links Éigean na Ghàidhealach with Éigean na Ghàidhealach, the language crisis and the climate crisis. Now, on the global scale, Paul Meighan brilliantly illustrates this connection when he says that English speakers, in particular decision-making elites, who enact this worldview of linguistic, cultural, and cognitive superiority, have either wittingly or unwittingly subjugated indigenous, non-dominant cultures and languages and legitimized the destruction of ecosystems. So I hope that by now I've illustrated just how closely the Anthropocene, Chànain, and Chànain are all linked together. So I will now move on to Lèirsinn Ghàidhealach, the Lèirsinn, or meaning vision or perspective, through which I hope we will arrive at our Freagairtean, or answers. And to get there, I'll briefly tell you about my PhD research. So what I'm doing is studying the multifaceted Gaelic concept of dúchas, and the way that this concept has evolved, particularly from the 17th to the early 20th century. Now, I know that some of you here listening will have recently attended screenings of a really beautiful film called Dúchas Home, directed by Kirsty MacDonald and Andy McKinnon. A film which is a really moving account of the island of Berneray and how the Bjarnari conceived themselves in relation to their community and their native home island. And that deep sense of belonging, of course, is a major part of what dúchas is. Now, all languages evolve. Dúchas does not carry the same meanings as it did 400 years ago. But back then, as much as today, dúchas acted as a conceptual bridge between things like ancestry, heritage, place, language as well, things that are very dear to Gaels. And I'm by no means the first person to recognize the importance of dúchas. In the 2020 book that they wrote on culture and environment in the Scottish Ghàidhealach, Meg Bateman and John Purser put it this way: rather than plunder the dictionary for a sufficiency of nouns to encompass the meaning of dúchas, it is simpler to state that the whole purpose of this book and its contents is derived from dúchas and hopes to elucidate it in the context of the visual throughout the ages. And that's 900 pages long, so there's quite a lot to elucidate, as you can see. Now, John McInnes, on the other hand, recognized the importance of dúchas too. He echoed Bateman and Purser's sentiment about it being difficult to translate dúchas into English. However, McInnes also recognized that in the past, long before the Education Act of 1872, a Gaelic way of experiencing the world was developed through instruction in panegyric Bárdach. Now, he wrote that the native Gael who is instructed in Bárdach carries in their imagination not so much a landscape, not a sense of geography alone, nor of history alone, but a formal order of experience in which these are all merged. The native sensibility responds not to landscape, but to dúchas. And I would argue that this means that certain concepts, like dúchas, dúolchas, buntanas, shenachas, áideachas, and this list is by no means exhaustive, connect up to form a way of knowing and seeing the world, also referred to as an epistemology, which is uniquely Ghàidhealach. This is the Lèirsinn Ghàidhealach, or Gaelic perspective, mentioned in my title. Now, I've only lived in the Hebrides for a very meager 2.5 years myself, and yet in this time I've experienced firsthand that a uniquely Ghàidhealach Lèirsinn, or epistemology, as well as traditional ecological knowledge, is still alive. But, as is often the case with minority or indigenous languages, the breadth and vitality of this knowledge within the living tradition is not in a secure position. Some of this knowledge unfortunately passes on to the other world, so to speak, with the passing of every elder. This living knowledge, the thousands of place names that don't appear on OS maps, the croft histories, the locations of wells that never dry up and have clean, fresh water, forgotten hill grazing routes and peat roads, all have a huge value ecologically, socially, and even linguistically. But the flip side of Lèirsinn Ghàidhealach, as is the case with other languages and cultures which have experienced systemic oppression, is that vast amounts of Gaelic knowledge systems have been suppressed by the dominant English worldview and education system. And to illustrate that, I'll take crofting as an example. Scholars like Frederick Jonsson and Ian McKinnon have pointed out that the crofting system was initially introduced into the Highlands and Islands as a practical project based on Enlightenment ideology of moral and natural improvement, as a means of organizing processes of internal or domestic colonization to improve society and nature and to civilize the Gaels. This forced populations to pursue wage labor and abandon traditional tenure systems and agricultural processes like transhumance, shealing practice, or the run-rig division of arable land. Now, these top-down changes imposed upon local populations came from proprietors and factors as much as they later came from the demands of the free market economy, and even the government, such as the Board of Agriculture's improvement schemes, which introduced non-native seed varieties, or bulls or stallions, or even machinery, which were not always suited to every locality's climate. So the great irony here is that it is precisely through crofting that we retain traditional ecological knowledge in the Gaeltacht, both in the generational place-based knowledge that many crofters still possessed, as well as through the vestiges of pre-improvement agriculture that manifest through things like sumings, common grazings, shared machinery, or bowls organized at township level and things like that. Now, over time, the combined forces of capitalism and Soillse Béarla have chipped away at this Lèirsinn Ghàidhealach. Although its survival is tied to the Gaelic language, even in places which have all but lost Gaelic, my peers conducting research in such areas tell me that at the very least, certain aspects of this Lèirsinn are still alive. And more importantly, the young crofters and young folks raised in these areas are showing an acute interest in recovering native land practices, crafts, and skills through this Lèirsinn. Now, I believe that if these youngsters got access to land, and of course we need a lot more work done on the Chànain front for that to happen, exciting developments a way to solve. Up and down, a very brief introduction to what a Lèirsinn Ghàidhealach might be has highlighted that there is an immense store of traditional ecological knowledge in the Gaelic language, both living and awaiting recovery. On Tobrandúolchas, the footnotes of Carmina Ghàidhealacha, Frank Fraser Darling's fieldwork among crofters, and so forth. The creative community ethnology, which was proposed by McFadden and Sandylands, is a method that I believe could be very effective at fostering intergenerational knowledge exchange and cultural recovery in Gaeltacht communities. This Gaelach epistemology has a value that I would love to see widely recognized, especially at decision-making levels. And the more people, Gael or otherwise, interact with it, the value of it will only increase. But what kind of Freagairtean answers or solutions can we arrive at for our three question? The Chànain, Chànain, and the Anthropocene. Now, looking through the lens of Lèirsinn Ghàidhealach, the connection between these three is so obvious. Tackling Chànain would require strong arguments from the canon. oral histories of resistance to the clearances, testimonies from the descendants of land raiders, new songs celebrating dúchas and connection to place, and many more. Tackling Chànain, on the other hand, requires things like access to housing so that those who wish to stay in the Ghàidhealach, return to the Ghàidhealach, or move into the Ghàidhealach have a way of doing so. The marketing of crofts as an investment opportunity, on the other hand, must cease, while young people interested in Chréichearach need opportunities to learn from elders and access to land as well. The curriculum that child or adult learners of Gaelic follow should reflect aspects of Lèirsinn Gaelach, with Gaelic culture going hand in hand with language learning. Now, finally, the knowledge of elders should be recognised and valued. And a 21st century alternative of the Ceilidh House has to be set up in which intergenerational transmission of traditional ecological knowledge can be facilitated. In this regard, and so many others, we have much to learn from Indigenous communities, particularly in North and South America, who have been working tirelessly to prioritise this aspect of language and cultural transmission. This is something that comes up in Paul Megan's 2022 article on language revitalisation and traditional ecological knowledge, which I really recommend. And finally, there is the Anthropocene. The Ghàidhealach has a long history of what would be called environmentalism in English, although it was rather more a life way, entangled with dúchas and other aspects of a Gaelic epistemology. Meg Bateman points this out in her essay on the environmentalism of Donnachaidh Bán, the Bard. In Áran do Gleanurachi, it is clear that where nature thrives, so does man. Where crops are planted, so too are songs sung. Man's stewardship of nature is natural because man is part of nature and is no less natural than bird songs and beavers' dams. Man and the land belong together. And Donnachaidh speaks of Gleanurachi as the place where he belongs and should be buried. In Áran and Ballagharan, he sees it as Minatarach, that the glens have become depopulated and wrong, that a man has to leave the place inhabited by his forebears. Dealing with the Anthropocene from a Gaelic perspective will therefore require climate-resilient communities. This is directly linked to the health of crofting across the Ghàidhealach and the continued adherence or perhaps re-adherence to principles of traditional ecological knowledge, such as the use of locally sourced seaweed and manure rather than imported chemical fertilizers, the cultivation of local cereal and vegetable crops, leaving space for animals like waders, mixed herd animal agriculture with hardier native breeds, the resurgence of Highland and Island dairying and perhaps even shealing practice, and so on and so forth. Of course, if achieving all of that didn't sound difficult enough, the final point is about instigating epistemic change. That is, switching up our value systems and seeing the place where we live and the world around us through Donnachaidh Bán's eyes, so to speak. That is, seeing ourselves as part of nature in a truly decolonized, non-Western way. Now, the Freagairtean I have proposed here are not exhaustive. I realize too that some of these Freagairtean may not be easily enforceable. Nonetheless, I hope that I have made a case for how caring for and recovering more of a Lèirsinn Gaelach or Gaelic epistemology may help us find creative and yet culturally and geographically appropriate solutions to the contemporary issues facing the Gaelach today. And since Lèirsinn also translates as vision, the uses for this epistemology, I think, are inherently forward-looking and visionary to create policies that are, well, more Gaelach. Thank you very much.